Northstar here with another episode of my Northstar Talks Politics. Now, today I wanted to talk briefly about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the perversion of accounts of history, and the erasure of inconvenient truths. Now, first of all, for those who've never heard of these, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in the context of Operation Dirty Trick, Operation Mongoose, and a variety of US programs intended to overthrow the Cuban government. These were, as the name suggests, such as Dirty Trick, underhanded, dishonest programs. Dirty Trick specifically involved trying to blame the Cuban government if the Mercury space mission should fail by falsifying evidence of electronic interference from Cuba in order to justify an invasion of the country. Operation Mongoose involved the deployment of ultimately 6 10-man special operations teams to Cuba to conduct sabotage, targeting sugar mills, railways, power plants, oil refineries, and factories. Most infamously, on November 8th, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or rather just after the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the denouement of the crisis, there was such an attack carried out. The Cuban government wrote a letter to the United Nations claiming that 400 workers have been killed in the factory attack, which it's a confirmed attack. The death toll, there is no independent confirmation of, and yet, if you look around, it's extremely hard to find records of this. Even though there was a letter written to the United Nations, it should be extremely well documented. But history, and this is my point, history is told in a biased and one-sided manner, in the United States especially, but I think you could make a case that every country in the world does this to some degree. We get a snapshot of the past colored by what those in power want us to see. People want Cuba to be the bad guys, so we don't talk about how we were blowing up factories and railways in their country around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not to mention, the United States set off the crisis by stationing nuclear missiles in Turkey before the nukes were placed in Cuba. That the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba was a direct response to the United States putting missiles in Turkey, which shares a land border with the Soviet Union, as well as being, I believe, closer to Moscow than where the missiles were placed, than the missiles in Cuba were to Washington, D.C. So this was a greater transgression, and the Soviets didn't even match the scale of what the U.S. did, and yet were portrayed as the bad guys in the U.S. media, to the point where almost no one has heard of the Turkish missiles unless they're a history buff. And the November 8th attack, it's almost never talked about. You find sparse references to it in the works of a historian of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Noam Chomsky has a reference to it on his website, for instance, too, which is partially referencing that historian's work. You can probably find it in some archives that are not well digitized. The point being, is this occurred, whether the death toll is really 400 or not, no one talks about it. Operation Dirty Trick, practically not heard of. When you search Operation Mongoose, you will literally get propaganda, stuff like, "We Are the Mighty," which is some website that tries to glamorize US imperialism. You won't get factual, unbiased information. The closest you come is Wikipedia, which, as we all know, anyone can edit, and governments often encourage, let's just say, individuals to edit in biased manners, whether explicitly with actually employing people to do it or encouraging their citizens to rewrite things. Governments all around the world do this. It's dangerous, but occurs. So I guess the lesson of the story is to always take everything with a grain of sand. To peer a little closer, you will find lies, half-truths, and things people are just simply mistaken about everywhere. You can find it in the rhetoric of the left. You can find it in the rhetoric of the US government. You can find inconsistencies or compromises been accepted. For instance, you will see in the program of Marxist parties, they will talk about the Prussian proletariat, but they will simultaneously harbor resentment and ill will towards prostitutes, to give you an example of a very oppressed group. That's because, if I remember correctly, Marx personally had some biases that show up in his writings. And so rather than trying to liberate an oppressed group that's one of those who suffered most under capitalism, when communist regimes took power, they would often, in a compromise to social conservatives, continue to victimize a group that was already victimized, and certainly not see them as people who were exploited and part of the proletariat as much as industrial workers. You'll see this in how, if you ask a Marxist about the right opposition or left opposition, you'll just get things like, oh, Bukharin was a revisionist. Okay, what does that mean? You'll get a blank stare. You, of course, get this in capitalist. If you try and ask them what they think surplus value means, if they don't try and use a redefined version of definition of value that isn't the definition that, say, Adam Smith used of the term. Literally, capitalists went about redefining that term, even when Adam Smith used the same definition essentially that Marx did, just so that they could make the Marxist definition invalid. In the process, making Adam Smith's work a little less comprehensible as well. You'll see this in, as I said, things like Operation Mongoose not being talked about openly and honestly. You'll see this in the sparse records on Operation Dirty Trick. You'll see this history is constantly rewritten and colored, and then we're expected to believe that certain nationalistic versions of it are just the God-given truth. So, all right, that's my thoughts on that. I hope this was interesting to some of you. Have a wonderful day. Till next time, maybe I'll have something better to talk about.